How many of you can confidently say that you can name one of the concentration camps in the Holocaust? Okay, the reason I ask is because I saw a study by the news organization Now This that held a survey of 11,000 Americans between the ages of 18 to 39. And they asked that question and other questions also, and there was 11% of that 11,000 thought that the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. And of that 11,000 people, within those who were Gen Z and millennials, 48% of that population couldn't name one camp. They couldn't name Auschwitz. And I saw this and I thought that was alarming, only because that was one of the worst things that happened in the 20th century, and the 20th century was terrible, basically. And it just made me think of how important history is, because they say history repeats itself, and that is certainly more likely to happen when you don't know what happened in history. I'm not an expert on genocide or like government oppression or anything like that, and I'm not here to talk to you about the Holocaust, but I have studied over the last year, especially, just more about history and government tyranny that's happened in the past. And so what I want to talk to you about today is collectivization and a thing that happened in the USSR called dekulakization, and basically my opinion on why I think that these things are important for people to know. So Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines collectivization basically as the government control of production and industry of a state. And this was coined by Stalin and the Soviets in the late 20s, and the idea was for the Soviet state to control the means of production and industrialize the state to produce more profit. And what dekulakization was, the kulaks were a social class in, this was the dekulakization was the liquidation of a social class called the kulaks, and this happened between 1929 and 1933. And these kulaks were basically peasant farmers who before were serfs who were oppressed by the czarist regime in the 19th century. And these kulaks were peasant farmers, and they weren't way well off by any means. They were peasants still, but they did have a house and had animals and a plot of land, and they might have be able to afford people to work for them. And they were kind of the one percenters of the village, basically. And they were the ones who farmed everything, and that's how everyone ate. And these state officials, basically, they were communist intellectuals, went into these villages and told these people that basically that farmer down the road who has the brick house and the animals and the land took that from you. And this comes off of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto that basically states how anything that one man earns is taken from another. And so you can imagine the type of people that would be taking to this idea, who don't really do anything, and let's say you and me are hanging at the bar every night, and we're not very ambitious, and a person of authority comes in and tells us, you're owed that. And so these people formed mobs, and they went to these farmers' houses and took everything, because they thought that they were doing good for everybody because we're all entitled to it. And these kulaks, and it wasn't only the farmers, there was teachers and doctors and people who stood with these farmers, these kulaks, and said this is wrong. But basically everyone who was against the idea of collectivization, they were put on trains and they were shipped to Siberia, where they all died of typhoid and starvation, and they froze to death. And it was families, women and children, and this was the cause, basically, of 6 million people dying in the Great Ukrainian famine. And I would bet that you haven't heard about the Kulak class or know a whole lot about the Soviet Union, because like I said, I'm not an expert on it, but especially a year ago, I had no idea what that was. Why? I don't know. Because I think it's important, and I think that, like, for instance, something as terrible as the Holocaust, 6 million people died in the Holocaust, 6 million people died in the Great Ukrainian famine. They're not the same, because the Holocaust was 6 million people were exterminated. And that's a different sort of evil, but how lethal the two events were, statistically, were the same. And when I saw that statistic from the Now This survey, I thought that is, I mean, everyone's heard of the Holocaust, right? And you would think everyone's probably heard of Auschwitz and knows who Hitler is. But as we start to get away, and it's the younger generations like us who don't know as much as the older ones, and as we start to kind of get away from that, you would think, how could you forget an event like that? And you have the idea of how history repeats itself. You would think that it's almost inevitable for history to repeat itself if we completely forget history. So if we forget how we got here, then it could potentially happen again. And that's kind of my reasoning for, I enjoy reading into history, and I enjoy all that stuff, but I also think that it's important, and it's also almost should be common knowledge, events like the Holocaust, for instance, because that if we know how we got there, and the fact that we beat it, and we fought an entire Cold War over oppression and genocide, then that will help us stop that from happening in the future. And so that was just kind of what I wanted to talk about today, for giving my reason that I think that that's important for people to know. And I hope that your takeaway is maybe that you will be a little more inclined or excited to read about history on your own and think critically of it, and I don't know, spend some time looking into things like that, because I think it's important. Thank you.